All right, so this week we're in the second part of a series called Made for More. Made for More. If you weren't here with us last week, I'll catch you up real quick. We like to take our teachings and group them together in what we call a series. And so this week we're in the second part of a series called Made for More. All right, so think about this. I have this pair of cargo shorts, all right? Picture that. Cargo shorts, they're great. They're camouflage. They're long. They're probably a little too big. My wife's not crazy about them. They're not her favorite pair of shorts, but I love these things. When I was about 19 years old, my mom was working at a high school, and they had this policy, like the end of the school year, the lost and found, they just put the stuff out, like just take whatever. That's where I got those shorts from. They had a previous owner. I don't know who it was, but we have a connection through these shorts. The shorts, they're amazing, okay? They've got belt loops so you can wear a belt, but if you don't feel like wearing a belt, they also have a string on the inside. You can tie them up depending on what mood you're in. So I started wearing these shorts all the time because they were super practical. What I realized was that I accidentally started wearing them on some really significant days. So when my wife and I first got married, we moved 7 times in 1 year. 7 times. It was nuts. But as far as I can remember, I wore these shorts every time we moved because they just worked. So they started to feel really special to me. When my nephew was born, he was the first one in like that generation to be born, I wore my shorts to the hospital. Then when my daughter was born, I wore those same shorts. When my son was born, wore the same shorts. It became a thing like I gotta have those shorts. Now, they've been through a lot. I tried to wear them not too long ago and had to not wear them because now you can just completely see whatever underwear I'm wearing. They are beaten, they are ripped up, they've got stains, but I love them. And I feel like I got the most out of them, right? Like, it feels like they were used well. They did what they were made for. And now if it's time to retire them, so be it, right? As ridiculous as that might sound, that's how I want to feel about my life when I get to the end of it, you know? Hopefully, my wife will still like me, unlike my shorts. But really, I want to feel like I did what I was made for. You know, like I spent what I had on something worthwhile. So I could look back and feel like I did something, right? I did what I was made to do. And that's really what we're talking about here. Like imagine getting to the end of your life and feeling like I've run a good race. I've fought a good fight. I've done what I've been made to do. And so last week on week 1, we asked the question, what are you living for? What are you living for? Because if you look at where your energy, where your thoughts, where your time is going, a lot of times what we live for is a good indication of what we believe we've been made for. A lot of the voices that we hear on a regular basis, right? A lot of those voices through advertising, TV, social media, they communicate to me that I was made for me. I was made for me, right? Like I've got to make me happy. I've got to find what's going to make me satisfied. I am the ultimate end of my pursuits. I've been made for me. Now, while most of us won't say that, and most of us would frown upon a lifestyle that's self-centered, it's amazing how easily we can drift into just feeling like it's all about me. Last week, we looked at a teaching of Jesus that he had said a number of different times in a number of different places. It was recorded by his followers in different ways, probably because he said it so many times. But basically, the idea that he presented to them was a philosophy of life. It wasn't a threat, it was a philosophy of life. He said, whoever wants to save their life will lose it. In other words, the person who desires, like who's really working for themselves, the person who's looking ultimately to satisfy themselves in all of their pursuits, at the end of the day, they're going to look back and feel like they lived a small life, an empty life. He's like, this is how it works. But he says, whoever loses their life, whoever spends their life, whoever gives their life for something greater, he says, whoever loses their life for me and for the gospel will find it. Now, even if you're here today and you're like, I'm not into Jesus, I don't know what it means to like lose my life for the gospel, you probably can agree that there's part of us, there's like we were wired to be part of something that is beyond us, that is bigger than us, that lasts beyond us. And that's what Jesus is saying here. We were made to be part of a cause. Or in his words, he would say we were made to give our lives for him and this gospel of the kingdom, right? He would say we were made not for me, but for the mission. Now, the idea of being made for this mission, if I say like live your life, spend your life for Jesus and the gospel, it's like what in the world? I just think abstract religious language and pictures. But the idea here, if you were with us like last series when we talked about your kingdom come, your will be done, the idea is that Jesus is saying you were made to make the values of heaven a reality here on earth, to treat people with dignity and love and respect, to be agents of hope, a breath of fresh air. He's like, join me in this mission. And when we do that, it can be incredibly meaningful. Like we can look back and feel like we were part of something that outlived us. We spent ourselves for something worthwhile. If you want more details about that, you can go back and listen to what we talked about last week. It doesn't mean you like devote your life to religious practices or just go to church all the time. No, it means like the things that you do, you start to do for a greater reason. And maybe you still do all the same things, but there's a sense of purpose behind it. So we were made for a mission. That was part one of this series. Now, the question then, like I'm a pretty practical person. I'm like, okay, yes, but how? Like, how do we get there? What does this actually look like? And what Jesus said was that this mission would be accomplished through what he called the church. Like the church would bring the realities of heaven to earth. And depending on what your history is with the church, that's either like, okay, or like, what? You know, maybe that's where you're like, no, thank you. Now, here's where I get off the bus, right? The church has done a lot of good and it's done a lot of harm, right? The church has gotten it so right and gotten it so wrong. But according to the way things were supposed to be, Jesus wanted the church, his followers, to bring about his like goodness, the values of heaven here to earth. So if you struggle with that concept, the reason I think you might struggle with that concept, the reason I should say why I have struggled with that concept is what comes to mind when I think of church, right? And my place in church. Like really, how is the church supposed to change the world? Like really, how is that? How does the church have the ability to do that? And what's cool is that we have some letters that were written by early followers of Jesus who had to explain what the church was supposed to be before people had a concept of church. Like they had to explain the actual practical details of this movement, how it should function. And if we look at that, it might be pretty different from what comes to mind when you and I think of the word church, especially if you have a negative concept of church. And the great thing the thing I love so much about this is that it's another one of those things that we read that was written 2,000 years ago that is just like so far ahead of its time. If you're someone who's into organizational and business psychology, stuff like that, this has some of those concepts that we're talking about now, but they were talking about it like 2,000 years ago. So even if you're not a person of faith, I think this could be helpful for you, okay? So the question is, like, there's this cause, right? This cause to, like, bring about the realities of heaven here to earth, and it's done through the church. What does that look like, all right? And the Apostle Paul writes a letter to a group of followers of Jesus in a city called Ephesus, and here's how he describes what it's like. He says this. He says, so Christ himself, that's Jesus himself gave the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the pastors, and the teachers. He's talking about leaders in the church. He's like, Jesus himself has given people certain abilities and skills to lead the church. Now, there's a lot of argument about what exactly he means by these titles, but to give you pretty simple definition, it's like the apostles are the startup people, the prophets are the people that keep things in line, the evangelists are those that are spreading it, and the pastors and teachers are those that are nurturing and sustaining this movement, right? And so those are the leaders. And then he says, to equip his people for the works of service so that the body of Christ may be built up. These leaders are here to equip the people for the works of service, to serve the world so that the body of Christ, this is the church, may be built up. Now, there's a lot of language here, but picture this, right? If you think of a lot of businesses, you've got the leaders up top, right? It's like a triangle, like this. Leaders up here, and then all the levels of the organization, right? In the church, however, that's flipped. It's the other way. You have the leaders at the bottom, and their job is to build up the church, to raise up, to equip the body of the church, the people, to do the works of service that will change the world. Don't lose sight of the mission that we're talking about here, so that the body may be built up. He says this, he says, until we all reach unity in the faith and in the knowledge of the Son of God and become mature. He says, attaining to the whole measure of the fullness of Christ, right? Very simple, straightforward, right? Okay, just kidding. He's there. Now, you got to remember when you're reading this stuff, this is a letter that's written by someone to a group of people in a specific situation at a certain time. He's writing to a church in a city called Ephesus, and in that church, there was a sharp divide between Jewish people and non-Jewish people, what they called Gentiles. And they couldn't figure out how to live together in the same group of people. And so what Paul's saying is, as we continue to grow and mature, we will reach a place of unity. This is very contextually specific here, though I think it's true in other areas as well. He says this, then we'll no longer be infants, tossed back and forth by the waves and blown here and there by every wind of teaching and by the cunning craftiness of people in their deceitful scheming. Okay, seems to take a turn, but this is another thing that's very contextually specific. Whenever Paul was starting a church, there were people who would wait for him to leave that area, and they would come right in after him and try to undo what he did because they didn't like this whole movement. And so he's saying, the more that we grow and understand this, the easier it will be to resist people who are trying to break down what's being built up. Very contextually specific, that's not happening here. It's not like there are people coming in after the service trying to undo what's happening in the service, okay? He says this, he says, instead, speaking the truth in love, we will grow into become in every respect the mature body of him who is the head, that is Christ. From him, he says, the whole body, joined and held together by every supporting ligament, grows and builds itself up in love as each part does its work. Got it? Right? I'm sweating. There's a lot there. But what he's explaining here is this is what it looks like when this group of people is doing what needs to be done to make an impact in the world, right? So let me give you a real simple summarized definition. And if you want, you can go, in fact, I think you should. If you have a Bible, you can go to Ephesians 4 when you go home and sit with this passage and look at it. And what you'll see is there's a few themes here. This is the idea of the church. And this is a definition. It's not perfect, but it simplifies all that, right? Church. We're going to say church. The church is not like leaders. It's a growing group. A group that's increasing and being built up, right? A growing group of growing people. Remember the word mature? How many times that came up? It's all of the people in the church who are following Jesus are growing themselves while the group is growing. And they're doing this serving people, equip the saints for the work of service, right? Out of love for people. This is the picture of the church that Paul's describing. It's a group of people, a growing group of growing people, serving people out of love for people. It's really that simple. And when this is happening, it has the ability to change the world. It has the ability to impact communities. In fact, you might have missed this, but he refers to this group of people as the body of Christ, right? The church, the body of Christ. Now, when you think body of Christ, I don't know what your background is, but maybe you think communion, right? You think of the bread. And sure, that like makes sense at that point in that time, right? There's a time for that. But he also uses this term, body of Christ, to talk about this group of people. Meaning, there was a time when Jesus himself was here. His literal body, flesh and blood, was here, right? But then he left, and he left behind people who follow him. And now those people are his body. Like, it's his presence in the world through those people. Like, he's setting the bar pretty high, right? This is why I'm asking you to kind of set aside what you picture when you picture church and try to like catch the potential of what he's saying here. In other words, this might sound extreme, but I think this is the point. Paul's saying that the church is the new Jesus. In terms, I'm not saying you should worship the church. I'm not saying you should pray to the church. Not the point. My point is, if we're talking about impact in the world, when Jesus was around, he was making an impact. He left, and he left behind followers that are now the replacement for that. That's what it means to be the body. So think about it like this. If Jesus himself moved into this community, think about how cool that would be, right? He probably would be out serving people. He'd be making an impact. He'd be known for his love for people. He'd bring hope to people. It'd be nice if he considered himself a resident of this community. What Paul's saying here is that when a church comes into a community, it should feel like that. Like, they should be a group of people that love people, that serve people, that bring hope to people, that impact people as if Jesus himself were there. That's how this world change happens. Now, let me just say this like as a little caveat. If you're someone who's like not totally sure about Jesus, not sure if you're on board with the church thing, there is always room for you to come and see, to just sit and listen and take it in and see if this stuff makes sense. But if you are a follower of Jesus, then you're part of this growing group of growing people, serving people out of love for people, okay? So we're talking about world change, right? This body. The point that Paul's making here, and this is the point that's kind of hard for me to wrap my mind around, this world-changing body of people, his point here is you are part of it. You are a part of it. I am a part of it. And almost every time the Apostle Paul brings up this image of a body, this world-changing group of people, he addresses the unspoken objection that feels like, oh, I don't matter. Like my place in it is not all that important. He says, remember this is at the very end, he says, from him the whole body, joined and held together by every supporting ligament. He doesn't say limb, like the big things. It's like the little things. I remember in 9th grade I learned ligaments link bones to bones. That's what a ligament does, in case you didn't know that, right? He's talking about a small part. And he's like, it's every part that holds this together. If you feel like you're not an important part of it, then you need to understand the importance of a ligament. Like, it's what holds everything together. So some of you might remember, like about a year ago, I hurt my knee playing basketball. And it was a big scene. I had this big white brace. I was on crutches. Before I was on crutches, I was in a wheelchair, you know. Like when I get hurt in my house, it's a big deal, right? You ever heard of a man cold? Anybody ever heard of that? Yeah, it's like a cold that's like 1,000 times worse. That happens in my house. And so I didn't need a wheelchair, but I had a wheelchair, and it was great. My mom made me soup, because that's what you make when someone's in a wheelchair, right? It was great. It was great. And what happened, I thought I tore my ACL. It turns out the ACL, it's some kind of ligament. That's what the L is. I don't know what the A and the C is. But I ended up not. I tore my meniscus, and so this isn't even a story about a ligament, so the metaphor kind of breaks down a little bit. However, My point is, I ended up being okay. What I can tell you is that you can live without a ligament, but you won't be what you could be. right? And that's what he's saying here. You can sit on the sidelines, but you're a needed part. You can live without a ligament, but you won't be what you can be. Then he goes in a little bit deeper, and actually, like, if you look, he gives a reason for why you may feel like you don't matter. It's in this one word right here. He says, it grows and builds itself up, this body, as each part does its work. It's possessive. Like, not as each part does some work, but as each part does its work. In other words, there's a specific part that each part plays. In a letter to the church in Corinth, similar thing, he's drawing out a similar metaphor. He says this. He says, all right, now if the foot, talking about the body, if the foot should say, because I'm not a hand, I don't belong to the body, he's like, it wouldn't for that reason stop being part of the body. Or he gives another metaphor, same thing. He says, if the ear should say, because I'm not an eye, I don't belong to the body, it would not for that reason stop being part of the body. In other words, if the hand is measuring itself according to its ability to be a foot, pretty quickly it's going to feel like maybe it doesn't have a place here. Right? He goes on, he says, if the whole body were an eye, where would the sense of hearing be? If the whole body were an ear, where would the sense of smell be? But in fact, God has placed the parts in the body, every one of them, just as he wanted them to be. The point here is that there's a body, you're part of it. But do you know which part? Do you know what you bring to the table? Do you know how you're wired? Do you know what kind of personality you have compared to other people and their personalities? Do you know what your strengths are? Do you know what your weaknesses are? This is, if we're talking about how we were made, and I would argue this is true inside the church and outside the church. So if you're not on board with the church thing, this may make sense to you, right? I would argue that we thrive. Like, it feels like you're doing what you were made to do when we have a purpose and a specific position. Right? Like last week we talked about the purpose, this mission, this whole idea of changing the world, of like bringing about the values of Jesus and heaven to life here today. That is a shared purpose. But within that, we have a specific, I have a specific position. We have a shared purpose and a specific position. And the more you understand what you bring to the table specifically, the more fulfilled you'll be in your work wherever it is. So I'll give you an example, right? And we try to think like this as a church. This is how the church was designed to function, with each part doing its work, what it was made to do. We try. We're not the best. We're working on it, but this is what we're going for, because this is the picture of the church that the Apostle Paul painted, right? There's someone on our team. Her name is Alex, all right? Let me tell you about Alex, in case you haven't met Alex. Alex makes whatever she touches magical. Right? If you've been to our start party, it really feels like a party. There's balloons, there's confetti, there are cactuses that light up on all the tables. It just feels fun. That's what she does. That's her job. Just show up. Hey, we'll be like, can you sprinkle some fairy dust on this idea? And it's just like, boom. If you look downstairs when you walked in, there's all these balloons, right? There's the thing with the streamers by the door and the bats, and that's Alex. She just shows up and she's like, I can make that fun. I think Alex could jazz up the DMV if you gave her enough time, right? She just makes things fun. If you were at our launch party, our launch rally on Thursday, we had these balloons. It said Thirch. There's a thing up here. It just was fun. That's what she does. And so that's what it looks like for her to do her part, right? And we've seen that. And when you're doing what you do so well, and it's part of a bigger picture, it is so so fulfilling. We've got someone on our guest services team. Her name's Fritzy. She works downstairs behind the counter. She's one of those people, you give her a to-do list and she just burns that thing up, right? Like she will fire off things that need to be done so fast. It's how she functions. She's a task person and she gets things done like nobody else does. It's a person playing their part in a bigger mission, part of a bigger picture. There's a guy named Steve. You might have met him. He's a former police officer. Right now, he's upstairs training our security team. He's doing what he knows how to do to help equip this body. It's the right person in the right place, and it's a beautiful, beautiful thing when it happens. There's someone downstairs. You might have met him, especially if you go to this service. Another Steve. We like Steves around here. He stands in the middle, right? He's got a shaved head. He kind of makes fun of everybody who walks in. He's probably made fun of you. You know who I'm talking about, right? He's there. He just eases the tension, right? And he's playing an important part in this bigger picture. And there's something so amazing about having the right person in the right place. And this is how the church has been made to function. If you've ever been involved in a church and it's been unnatural or uncomfortable or unproductive, it might be because you're a hand trying to be a foot. So my question for you is, do you know what you bring to the table? Do you know what makes you unique? Do you know what you love to do? Like, what are your passions? What are the things that you're excited about, that you care about, that you love? You were made that way for a reason. Our staff here, we have gone through, I think, about 7 or 8 strength and personality assessments. There's things like, I said this, you heard that, which I know a bunch of you have taken. There's the Clifton Strength Finders test. There's the Enneagram. There's the Big 5 personality. They're all these things. And what they do is show you what makes you different from the person next to you and can enable you to find the right place for you where you'll thrive. It is fulfilling, but it's also freeing. Do you know why? Because when you know what you're good at, you also know what you're not good at. And the great thing about a body is that different parts have different roles. And so if there's something you're not good at, chances are there's somebody else who's good at it. So you let someone else do what they're good at. For me, I am a big idea person, right? I like to think about like why we should do something, why something matters. You know what I'm terrible at? Like unbelievably terrible? I am so bad at the details of a plan, at steps in the process. You don't want me touching the details. I'll try and I'll just mess it up. And so what will happen, we actually have some great detail people as a part of our team. And so now we're at the point where I'll be part of the meeting. I'll be like, hey guys, what about this? And I just like throw it out there and we'll talk about it if it's worth it. And then it's like time to put the plan together. And that's where I'm like, all right, I think my work here is done. Because there are people that hate big ideas but love steps in a process. And that's how a body works. A hand does one thing, a foot does another thing. It's incredibly freeing when you know what you're good at and what you bring to the table. I actually set up a web page. If you want, you can go to communitychurch.net/me. And I've listed all of the assessments that we take here. Some of them cost money, some of them are free. But if you want to find out what you bring to the table, how your mind works, what kind of skills and strengths you have, you can do them. They're all listed there. Now, okay, so if we're talking about the church, right, that's how the church functions internally, with the right people in the right spots, and it's a beautiful, beautiful thing. But remember the whole concept of like Jesus showing up in the world, in a community, right? And how that could change a community. I think this is even more powerful when it happens outside of the church. Like when followers of Jesus learn what they're good at and they bring those things to their community, that's when you start to see real impact, right? Like, so let me give you an example. If you're a mom who's got a minivan, and you thrive in the chaos of the carpool with the little kids and the yelling and the poking and the whatever, but somehow you can make that fun and you like it, like you can handle that, then lean into that. Like, do it. Be the mom who does the carpool thing and makes the carpool fun for the sake of all the other parents. Do that. If you hate that, don't do it. right? Or if you're the person that's great at making plans. We were just talking about this in my little friend group. There are a few moms there that just love planning. They're like, oh, in 9 weeks, let's meet at this location at this time. The weather will be just like this, and we'll do this. And they come up with the perfect plan, and they're like, let's do that. And we're like, great. To me, that's my worst nightmare, but they love that. And so, go, do that. If you love to plan, be the one that plans the things, that does the stuff. I heard a story about a guy who is just like, he's a peacemaker. Like, harmony is a really important thing to him. And that, along with his faith, along with his job, he was out volunteering at a school board for his district. And it was one of those meetings, somebody said something, like tempers got hot, all of a sudden it got really tense, and he's sitting there on the board as a board member, and he like stops the meeting, and he's like, hey, what would it look like for us to show a little grace to one another for the rest of this meeting? And all of a sudden the whole room was like, that is a beautiful picture of somebody who is aware of what they do well, using that to make an impact in a community. I heard another story about a woman who moved into a new place, a new community, and there was someone there who baked a pie, brought it over, wrote a note, and just said, hey, welcome to the community. You know why? Because she likes to bake pies, and she's good at baking pies. You don't want a pie that I baked, but that's what she does. You know, I think this can apply to the workplace as well. Like, it is a great thing when you have a job where you feel like you're doing what you've been made to do for a cause that's worthwhile. That's a great thing. But the reality is, most people don't get to do that. And I think if you're doing a job on a daily basis where you're working hard to provide for people you love and you don't find a ton of meaning in it other than the fact that you're providing for them, I think you should be applauded because that's responsibility. It's how you love your family. But even if you work at Macy's and you hate Macy's and you organize shoes and you hate organizing shoes and you don't wear shoes and that's your job, you can still look for opportunities to use the gifts that you have. If you're someone who loves talking to strangers, be the person that goes and talks to strangers. If you have some weird ability to remember people's birthdays, then be the one that remembers every staff member's birthdays and plan to have a cake in the conference room. That's what impact looks like. But you have to know how you've been made. You have to know how you've been made. I think when we see ourselves as part of a shared purpose, like when we understand we've been made for this mission, if you're someone who follows Jesus, and you have the ability to do what you love to do to further that mission, that's where we start to feel like we're doing what we've been made for. That's when we start to feel like we've been made for something that's bigger than ourselves. We're out of time, so I'm going to ask the band to come back up here. My favorite verse, this whole thing, what I want to leave you with, right here. Let me get that verse real quick before we take my TV. I don't know if you caught this, but this is in the passage that I read before. It says, God has placed the parts in the body, every one of them, just as he wanted them to be. There's something about that for me. You can take her now. There's something about that for me that is just so cool. The idea that God made you to do what you love to do what you've been uniquely equipped to do. We have been given gifts, skills, talents, drive, abilities, and we've been told to change the world. What if God has given us those things to change the world? What has he given you?